Hello and welcome to Sunnyside Crochet. Today we will be looking at a couple basic joining techniques for granny squares. So granny squares are the perfect summer project. They're small, they're easy to take to the park, on a picnic, sports practices, and vacation. And because they're small, they're also perfect for hot weather because let's face it, I don't want to do a blanket in the middle of summer, 90-degree weather, with sweat pouring off me, but I'm gonna have to because I ran behind. Anyway, so we're going to talk about joining techniques. We already have a couple basic granny squares under our belts, so we will do these joining techniques just so if you find one you like in our crochet along here, you can pick that, run with it, and make a blanket. Please be sure to share it to our Instagram or our Facebook page. I would love, love, love to see them. So yeah, like I said, at the end of summer or really any time when you have a box of granny squares laying around, you can take one of these great joining techniques and put your blanket together and stay cozy all winter long. So before we get started, I have 4 different techniques here that I'm going to show you that are pretty beginner friendly. The last one's a little interesting, but we'll break it down for you. Okay, so we're going to talk about my setup here. I have 4 granny squares, and I know it's a little hard to see with my camera here, so I have 2 down here and 2 up here. When I get ready to put a granny square blanket together, I usually take up the entire floor in the room of my house, or the last one I put together, I was staying in a motel, and I took up the entire kitchen area. You couldn't get in or out, which was fine with me because I was totally set on getting this blanket together. Okay, so my former go-to on how to join a blanket together, because it's easy, it works, and some of the other ones require a little bit of finesse, but this one is pretty straightforward. It's really easy, but it's hard to judge how long you need your string to be to work all the way up your row, because when I lay my blanket out, I like to work totally up a row and just keep going up and then work across just to make sure everything's together. I didn't miss any squares. It just helps to keep me a little more organized by laying everything out and seeing how it's going together. So, and you also get into some really long strings while you're doing this, but I will show you anyway how to do it. Okay. How I start, and I normally tie my strings off later, I don't do it when I start. I just take my plastic canvas needle and regular worsted weight yarn, and all I do is you have these 2 chain stitches in your corner on your traditional granny squares. I go into the top one because that is technically the first stitch going up this side, and I just run my needle through both of them and pull it through, and then I will go up to the next set of stitches, straight through, pull it through, and I like doing it that way because you get this nice, and it depends on what kind of look you're going for, but using a contrasting yarn, I like the diagonal kind of look here on the front, so that's why I really like doing it this way. And we're gonna keep going up, and I'm just pulling tight as I'm going just to show you guys how it looks as it's done. It's also a good idea to pull it tight as you're going because it's kind of hard to get the excess out of there once you get so far away from it. All right, straight across, pull it through. And you'll notice when I go through the chain spaces on here, I'm going through the stitch itself, not around the stitch. So you see I have yarn underneath my contrast color here. Up. And you see we're coming up on a knot from where I finished that one square. Okay, because there's my slip stitch, and I'm just going to go right underneath it into that last stitch. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep doing my lacing or sewing, however you want to call it. I've seen it called both ways. Right around my tail here, and then I'll cut it off later as I'm going through. All right, so that is how we finish our first join squares together. Notice I only went up to this bottom stitch in our chain 2. So I'm going to bring my next 2 down here so you can see, and I'm going to go into that top chain of our chain 2 in the corner there, and just right across and right into it. When I do this join between the 2 of them, I make sure to pull it a little bit tight, because if it's going to pull and get space in it, that is exactly where it's going to come out. Trust me. So we'll do that, and we will just keep going up this row. And then once you finish all the way up, get all your other rows all the way up going, then I do the same thing working across, just like that. Super easy, super nice. It doesn't give you any weird ridges, anything like that. It's a good basic joining technique. So we will be right back, and we will show you a slip stitch technique. All right, now for the slip stitch. Now, this one, we gotta line up, because you have to do it just right, or it gets a little ridge in it, and I don't like the little ridge in it. So the only thing we're going to be using in this, I put my tail underneath here. There we go. The only thing we're going to be using in this is that middle piece of yarn in each stitch, and because it's a slip stitch, we're just going to pull through. You can also do this with a single crochet if you desire, like that. The middle of that one, and the middle of this one, and pull through. Middle of that one, middle of this one, pull through. And again, this is something that I'll do laying on the floor with a blanket, so everything's all laid out, I don't miss anything. I'll keep going. And just as a really good check to make sure you're on the right track, you haven't missed a stitch, you know you have 3 in your granny stitch, and then 1 chain stitch, and I usually just make sure the chain stitches are lining up, and that's how I'm sure I did not skip a stitch as I'm going through using this technique. So like that. Okay, we're back to our knot again, and there we are up underneath. Now we're just gonna wrap around it. Just like that. Okay, there's our bottom chain stitch. And there we are. And this is up that side. Notice we have this nice little line in between our 2 squares. Your back will look like this. And you know, you get a nice little line in there, but you can definitely tell the front side from your back side, because sometimes with the double crochets, I mean, there's a slight difference, but it's kind of hard to tell. So moving on to our next set of squares, because like I said, we work in rows. Keep our tail underneath here so you don't get any weird ridges. And we're gonna work in that top chain and just pull through. Just like that. In the middle. And pull through. Now what I mean by ridges is how I used to do this was I would go through both and slip stitch and through both and slip stitch around that, slip stitch both and slip stitch, and it gives you a much different look versus the way I was doing it. You see, you get this ridge coming through here, but your other side, it doesn't look too bad. I mean, I could have gone through the chain instead of around it, and that would have looked a little more consistent. But to avoid this ridge and things like that going on, that's why I just do it the way we did it here. And that is basically it for our slip stitch. Like I said before, with the lacing or sewing technique, I will work all the way up one row and keep going down each row of the blanket and then work my way across to make sure I got everything and didn't leave anything out. That's just me. I'm kind of crazy when it comes to that kind of stuff. All right, so I will be right back and I will show you what I call the diamond technique. It's very pretty. I love this one. So I will be right back to show you it. All right, and we are back. We are going to work on our diamond joining technique. It is easily one of my new favorites. It looks very delicate, pretty. It adds a little layer of sophistication to some of your more intricate granny squares. And if you're looking for a nice open stitch because you want it as a warm weather blanket, this is a great technique for that. So I'm actually going to turn my 4 squares here. Normally I would have all of this laid out on the floor and I would just take a pillow and lay on the floor and just move around however I need to make this work, but since I only have 4 of them sitting here at the table, we're just going to do it this way. So what we are going to do to start is we are going to slip stitch in this first chain starting up our side. Remember, we have 2 chains in our corner here. We're going to go with the one in the next granny square starting up our side. So we slip stitch there. We are going to chain 3 to account for our granny stitch. Slip stitch in that chain space. Chain 3. Slip stitch in that chain space. And again. Chain 3, and we're back at that knot again. We're just going to ignore it this time because we're not doing anything with it. I will tuck that in and clip it off later, but not right now. I know I say that about every project, which is probably why I hate finishing projects. Anyway, all right, so we're at the end of our first square, and we need to account for another row of our diamond joining technique in between our granny squares coming this way, so we need a little bit of space. So we're going to add another diamond stitch in between them. So we're going to chain 3 and then slip stitch into that next granny square. Chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, slip stitch, chain 3, slip stitch, and again we're not doing anything with that knot or that tail hanging off. Chain 3, and then we're going to pretend like this is the top of our blanket. We're going to slip stitch through it just like we did at the bottom. We are going to chain 1 to give us a little bit of space between it and the next square, and we're going to turn our squares again just to line this up right. The reason I am working from this side is because is because I like the way the slip stitch looks from this side. You can do it however you want to do it. This is just personal preference for me and how I like the look of my slip stitch. Okay, so we chained one to have a little bit of space in there. We're gonna, because this is the top, we are going to go through that first chain stitch, starting that side right next to that granny square. We are only going to chain one this time, and because this is our second row, we're joining them together. We are going to slip stitch right about the spot of that second chain in there, chain one, and then we're going to slip stitch in that space in our granny square. So chain one, slip stitch in our new chain, and granny square, chain one, slip stitch, chain one, and slip stitch. And that is how we're going to join this together. I actually prefer doing this more than just doing a straight chain and weaving it through, because if you're doing that as you're going, your ends get tangled and it just makes a big mess. So I actually really like doing it this way. Slip stitch, chain one, next square, slip stitch, chain one. We're gonna do this square just like the last one. Chain one, slip stitch, chain, 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 and because we're back at the bottom, slip stitch through. And there we are. We have this beautiful little diamond pattern and space in between to get our diamond pattern coming across. And this is another one. I would work up and down each row and then come back and do it across to finish it up, just to make sure I got everything. But this is definitely one of my new favorite joins. I love it. It's just pretty, dainty. Like I said, it just adds a little bit of sophistication. It's not your typical join, something a little different. And I think that's why I appreciate it. I just like it. So we will be right back with our back-to-back join, which is another one of my new favorites. So we will be back in a minute. All right, and we are back to do our back-to-back joining technique. So for this one, I only have 2 squares here with me right now. This one actually works across row by row or up and down row by row, whichever way you want to do it. And then you just add on your next row above it or next to it, however you're working on it. Okay, so for this one again, I'm going to turn. And this is another one. It's another one of my new favorites. It looks almost like another row of granny stitches on your project. It's a very nice addition. I'm gonna turn it over to start. All right, so I'm planning this as the top, which is, it was originally facing away from me. So this is going to be our top. So I would join the next row right here. So I'm actually going to start in this corner over here, work around, down, up, and then we're going to switch over to this side. And that's when we're going to start to join them together. And then we're going to work around this other one and then across the top, and we're done with that row. And then you would add on your next row. So you would work down this square, and as you're working across here, you would be joining together like we're going to do between these two right here. So it's basically the same thing, you're just going to be doing it a little more in the next row. So let's get started. So I'm going to start in this first corner with a double crochet. We're just going to bust right into a granny stitch. So there's 1, 2, 3, chain 1, 1, 2, 3, okay, we chain, and 1, 2, 3, chain, 2 for the corner, another granny stitch, alright, another 2 granny stitches in the corner, chain 2, three, 1. Okay, we're going up the side that we're going to be joining together. 2, 3. Okay, in this tail I'm going to tuck in our next granny stitch, and then it can be trimmed off. I just normally tuck them in the next row. Okay, here we are in the corner. All right. Then we are going to actually go right into this next one. So there's 1, 2, 3. And then instead of chaining 1 like we have been doing, we're just going to slip stitch into the chain space behind it and keep going into the next granny stitch. So there's 2, 3, and we're going to slip stitch that space, next granny stitch, slip stitch, granny stitch. Okay, so we're going to do one slip stitch across here, chain one, and then we are into our next granny stitch in our corner. And we're just gonna keep working around. Chain one. Chain two on the corner. Another granny stitch in the corner. All right, chain two in the corner. We're gonna come back across the top. All right, so we'll chain one. Okay, and then in here we're going to chain one, single crochet in that middle, chain again, and then right into the next granny stitch. Just like that. Looks pretty even between the top and the bottom. Okay, and then we are just going to finish out this row, and like I said, the next row we would just do that same joining technique all the way across the bottom here. Just slip stitch between these two right here as you're working across. And that is pretty much it for that. So I hope you enjoyed our tutorial today and that you have a few new techniques to use on your granny square adventure this summer. So please check us out at sunnysidecrochet.com for more great ideas. Follow us on Facebook, Pinterest, and now Instagram. And please be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Please, please, please share us with all of your friends. Have a great day, and as always, happy hooking!